Billionaire kicks black maid out of his house not knowing she's his long-lost mother. What if the person you've been searching for your entire life was standing right in front of you, and you didn't even know it? Margaret Williams moved through the marble hallways of the $20 million mansion with the same quiet grace she'd carried for 30 years of cleaning other people's homes. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work, carefully dusted the family photos lining the grand staircase. She paused at one particular picture, a young boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Something about that face made her heart skip, the way it always did when she looked at it. She whispered a prayer, the same one she'd said every morning for 26 years. "Lord, please let me find my baby boy." What Margaret didn't know was that her prayer was about to be answered in the most unexpected way. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Marcus Wellington III had everything money could buy, but the hollow ache in his chest reminded him daily of what he'd lost. At 36, he'd built a technology empire worth $3 billion, yet he'd trade every penny to know where he came from. The adoption records were sealed, and his wealthy adoptive parents had died in a car accident when he was 16, taking his origin story with them to the grave. Now, standing in his penthouse office overlooking the city, he felt more alone than ever. Margaret arrived at the Wellington estate every Tuesday and Friday, just as she had for the past 8 months. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, had hired her after their previous cleaner quit. Margaret needed the work. Her small apartment rent wouldn't pay itself, and at 58, jobs weren't easy to find. She took pride in her work, treating each home as if it were her own. The other staff appreciated her gentle nature and warm smile that could brighten anyone's day. The trouble started when Marcus returned home unexpectedly from a business trip to Tokyo. He'd been flying for 14 hours, his head pounding from lack of sleep and stress. The house was supposed to be empty except for essential staff. As he walked through his living room, he noticed small changes, a throw pillow repositioned, magazines stacked differently. His privacy was sacred to him, and someone had been moving his things. "Patterson!" he called out, his voice sharper than usual. The older woman appeared quickly, her face flushed with concern. "Who's been in my private spaces?" he demanded. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, holding a dust cloth, her eyes wide with confusion. She'd been cleaning the baseboards near his desk, just as Mrs. Patterson had instructed. Marcus felt his anger rise. This woman, this stranger, had been touching his personal belongings. "I want her out," he said coldly, pointing at Margaret. "Now." Margaret's heart sank as she saw the fury in his eyes. She'd done nothing wrong, but she recognized that look. She'd seen it before in other wealthy homes where people like her weren't truly welcome. The kindness she'd felt in this house was about to disappear. Margaret's hands trembled as she gathered her cleaning supplies. "Sir, I'm sorry if I did something wrong," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Patterson told me to clean everywhere." But Marcus wasn't listening. The stress of his failed business deal in Japan, combined with his lifelong feelings of abandonment, had created a perfect storm of rage that had nothing to do with dust cloths and everything to do with the pain he carried inside. "I don't care what Patterson told you," he snapped. "This is my home, and I don't want strangers going through my things." The word strangers hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd spent months caring for this house, polishing his trophies, organizing his papers with the same love she would have given her own family. But to him, she was just another expendable worker. Mrs. Patterson tried to intervene. "Mr. Wellington, Margaret is one of our best." But Marcus cut her off with a raised hand. His dark eyes, so much like Margaret's own, flashed with an anger that seemed to surprise even him. Margaret looked at his face again, studying the strong jawline, the way his eyebrows furrowed when he was upset. Something stirred in her memory, but the pain of being humiliated clouded her thoughts. As Margaret walked toward the door, she turned back one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, son," she said gently, using the same tone she'd once used with her own child decades ago. The word son stopped Marcus in his tracks. Something about the way she said it, with such tenderness despite his cruelty, made his chest tighten. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Margaret stepped out into the cold evening air, clutching her purse with the faded photo inside, the only picture she had of her baby boy, taken just days before she was forced to give him up. She had no idea she'd just been thrown out by the very child she'd been searching for all her life. 3 days passed, and Marcus couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face when he'd dismissed her. He'd thrown himself into work, but even his most important meetings couldn't distract him from the memory of her gentle voice calling him, son. He told himself it was just a figure of speech, something older women said to younger men. But late at night, staring at the ceiling of his empty mansion, he felt a guilt that wouldn't go away. Margaret sat in her small apartment, staring at the photo she'd kept hidden in her wallet for 26 years. The baby in the picture had the same dark eyes as the angry man who'd thrown her out. She'd been 17 when she gave birth, unmarried and terrified, with parents who disowned her for bringing shame to the family. The adoption agency had promised her baby would go to a loving family, but they'd never told her his name or where he'd gone. She'd spent decades wondering if he was happy, if he was safe, if he ever thought about the mother who'd loved him enough to let him go. Mrs. Patterson couldn't stand to watch the household fall apart. She'd seen how Marcus had been drinking more, snapping at everyone, and working until exhaustion. She'd also called Margaret twice to check on her, worried about the older woman's spirits. That's when Margaret had mentioned something that made Mrs. Patterson's blood run cold. "I keep thinking about his eyes," Margaret had said. "They reminded me of someone I used to know." The breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson was organizing Marcus's study and found his adoption papers, filed away in a folder marked, "Personal." Her hands shook as she read the details. Baby boy, born November 15, 1988, at St. Mary's Hospital. Mother's name, Margaret Williams, age 17. Father unknown. The pieces clicked together like a puzzle she'd been unconsciously solving for months. Marcus's birthday was November 15th. She'd organized his party last year. Margaret's last name was Williams. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily in Marcus's leather chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. This explained so much: why Margaret always lingered near Marcus's baby photos, why she cleaned his spaces with such unusual care, why she'd seemed so heartbroken when he dismissed her. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. The truth was devastating and beautiful at the same time. Marcus had spent his whole life searching for his mother, and she'd been there all along, lovingly caring for his home, just waiting to be recognized. Mrs. Patterson knew she had to tell Marcus immediately, but she also knew his hot temper could make things worse. She decided to call Margaret first, asking her to come back to the house under the pretense of retrieving something she'd left behind. When Margaret arrived, Mrs. Patterson sat her down in the kitchen and gently explained what she'd discovered. Margaret's face went white, then flushed with a mixture of joy and terror. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Are you absolutely certain?" Mrs. Patterson nodded, showing her the adoption papers. Margaret burst into tears, 26 years of wondering and praying finally coming to an end. Marcus came home that evening to find both women waiting in his living room. His first instinct was anger. He'd specifically said he didn't want Margaret in his house. But something about the way they were sitting, the serious expressions on their faces, made him pause. "Mr. Wellington," Mrs. Patterson began carefully, "there's something you need to know." She handed him the adoption papers and watched as his face changed from confusion to shock to disbelief. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely audible. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, for the first time. The shape of her nose, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the gentle curve of her smile. It was like seeing his own reflection in an older, feminine form. Margaret stood up slowly, reaching into her purse with trembling hands. She pulled out the faded photograph of baby Marcus and held it next to his adoption papers. The dates matched perfectly. "I've been looking for you for 26 years, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Every job I took, every house I cleaned, part of me was hoping I'd find you somehow." Marcus's hands shook as he held the baby picture. It was him. He had the same photo in his own adoption file. The angry, successful businessman who'd built walls around his heart suddenly crumbled, and for the first time since childhood, he started to cry. "I threw you out," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I threw my own mother out of my house." Margaret stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding 26 years of separation. "Baby, you didn't know," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "How could you have known?" If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. The reunion that followed wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic music or perfect dialogue. Instead, it was quiet and real, filled with awkward pauses and gentle questions. Marcus and Margaret sat in his living room until dawn, sharing 26 years of separate lives. She told him about the job she'd worked to support herself, the nights she'd prayed for his safety, the way she'd kept his baby blanket all these years. He shared his loneliness growing up wealthy but emotionally empty, his desperate searches through adoption records, his fear that he'd been abandoned because he wasn't wanted. "I wanted you so much," Margaret assured him, her hand covering his. "Giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did. But I was 17, with no money, no family support. I thought you'd have a better life without me." Marcus understood now why he'd never felt complete, despite all his success. The missing piece had been her love, her presence, her stories about where he came from. Over the following months, they built their relationship carefully, like two people learning to trust again. Marcus bought Margaret a house near his estate, not because she needed his money, but because they'd both lost too much time already. She continued working, but now it was at a community center helping other single mothers, using her story to give them hope. Marcus discovered that having a mother meant more than having someone to love. It meant having someone who loved him unconditionally, who was proud of his achievements but would have been proud of him even if he'd never made a dime. Mrs. Patterson became the unofficial family historian, documenting their reunion with photos and stories. She often smiled watching them together, seeing how Marcus's sharp edges had softened, how Margaret's sadness had lifted. They'd found each other not through expensive investigators or dramatic searches, but through the simple act of being in the same place, at the same time, with hearts open enough to recognize love when it appeared. The lesson was profound yet simple. Sometimes what we're searching for is closer than we think, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and the miracle of family found.